Good morning to those tuning in from the East Coast, and good afternoon and evening to those joining us from further afar. I'm Dana Stroll, the Casson Fellow here at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and I will be moderating today's event with Ulal Rafai and Sam Dagher, assessing the strength of the Assad regime in Damascus after 9 brutal years of deadly conflict. First, a few housekeeping notes. People tuning in today are joining us this event on 3 different platforms. Some are in Zoom, some on Facebook Live, and others are following a live stream on the Washington Institute's website. For those joining us on live stream on our website or on Facebook, you can email questions you have throughout the event to policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. Again, policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. For those of you joining us on Zoom, please feel free to type your questions into the chat function at the bottom of the Zoom app. I will do my best to get through as many questions as possible, and we will conclude this event promptly at the end of the hour. First though, today, June 17th, is a significant day for U.S.-Syria policy. 180 days ago, the Caesar Civilian Protection Act was signed into law. Congress spent years debating and refining this law, which imposes sanctions on governments, companies, or individuals directly or indirectly funding Bashar al-Assad's regime in Damascus or contributing to its military campaigns. 1 hour ago, the State Department announced the first tranche of sanctions under the Caesar Act, and more will be announced today. So before our previously scheduled program, we are so pleased that Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Joel Rayburn is here to deliver short remarks on the implementation of the Caesar Act. I'm sure you all can understand today is an incredibly busy day for those working on Syria inside the U.S. government. So unfortunately, Deputy Assistant Secretary Rayburn will not be able to take questions. As after he departs, we're going to turn to our panelists, Ula and Sam. First, let me just introduce Das Rayburn. He has served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Levant Affairs and the Special Envoy for Syria since July 2018. Before that, he was a Senior Director for Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon at the National Security Council. He is a retired U.S. Army officer who served in a variety of assignments in the Middle East, Europe, and the United States from 1992 until 2018. He has also taught history at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point and is the author of several books and articles on the Iraq War. With that, Das Rayburn, thank you so much for joining us today, and over to you.
Well, thank you, Dana, and I'd like to thank the Washington Institute for Near East Policy for the kind invitation to address you this morning concerning the sanctions that are being released today and the Assad regime's actions and the broader U.S. effort to hold the Assad regime accountable and bring about a political solution to the Syrian conflict. So today, between the Treasury Department and the State Department, the U.S. government will be announcing a total of 39 sanctions designations, some under the Caesar Act, some under other authorities that Treasury and State have, but meant to accompany the Caesar Act. The significance of that is that it's a signal thing that the Caesar Act itself represents the legislative branch and the executive branch working together on a common policy of holding the Assad regime accountable for its atrocities and bringing about a peaceful resolution to the Syrian conflict. The signal thing about state and treasury working together under the authorities that each has is that this is not just 2 branches of government, but it's a whole of government across the executive branch effort to use all the tools at our disposal to bring about our common goals. In other words, for those who have been dreaming that there might be multiple options for U.S. policy, for example, that there might be a walkback of U.S. policy from holding the Assad regime accountable, today's sanctions being a virtually unanimous thing show that that's a fantasy. It's not going to happen, that there would be a sudden change and the United States would no longer have an interest in holding the Assad regime accountable for the mass atrocities that Caesar documented and uncovered. A word on that. This does stem from the courageous act of the photographer known by the pseudonym of Caesar more than 6 years ago, who smuggled out of Syria the horrible documentary evidence of the atrocities that the Assad regime was committing. And there has been a long effort within the Congress and within the executive branch to pass this legislation and now to implement it. We note, for example, that there's continued legitimate interest from Congress on the implementation of this legislation. A joint statement by the chairman and ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the chairman and ranking member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee on June 8th documented Congress's priority, which is vigorous, sustained enforcement of the Caesar Act in order to send a message to the regime and its enablers that Assad remains a pariah. It's important, we think, to focus on the reasoning behind this legislation. This is not just an American opinion about the Assad regime's acts. It's an international view and very strongly held. There are two recently issued United Nations reports that support the views put forward by the congressional leaders and also the executive branch in its policy. On April 6th, the UN Board of Inquiry issued a report outlining how the evidence indicated what we all have suspected all along, that the Assad regime and its allies launched attacks that devastated hospitals, schools, and other civilian infrastructure, even when these sites' locations were on the UN deconfliction list, which was created to protect these key pillars of civilian life. And that same week, the OPCW released its first report and attributed to the Assad regime responsibility for using sarin or chlorine gas in 3 separate attacks in 2017. And these are just 2 examples of the brutal war that the Assad regime, often with the help of its Iranian and Russian enablers, have waged against Syria's people, leaving at least 500,000 dead. The Caesar Act sanctions will be mandatory against targets that facilitate the Assad regime's production of oil, as well as those that facilitate the regime's acquisition of aviation-related goods, services, or technologies that are used for military purposes. So these are really, for the first time, sectoral sanctions that the U.S. executive branch is able to apply. A word on that: in the past, serious sanctions normally, for those who worked in the government, have had experience with sanctions. Oftentimes, there can be a very high hurdle for the evidence that you have to gather in order to prove legal sufficiency under certain sanctions authorities. The Caesar Act really lowers the bar for us. We don't have to prove, for example, that a company that's going in to do a reconstruction project in the Damascus region is dealing directly with the Assad regime. We don't have to have the evidence to prove that link. We just have to have the evidence that proves that a company or an individual is investing in that sector, in the construction sector, the engineering sector, most of the aviation sector, finance sector, energy sector, and so on. The Caesar Act also targets those that support mercenaries and foreign actors who are perpetuating the conflict on behalf of the Assad regime and its allies. And it also, as I referred to above, it targets those who are involved in war profiteering, who would provide significant construction or engineering services to the Syrian regime. The bottom line is that the Caesar Act's significant impact is a long-term one. It aims to foreclose any potential economic benefit from a so-called military victory by the regime and its enablers. Now, the goal of the United States in pursuing these targeted sanctions against the regime and its enablers is to promote accountability and deny the regime access to the international financial system until a political solution to the Syria conflict can be reached. I should stress that the sanctions that we're releasing today are part of our overall goal of ensuring that the parties to the Syrian conflict resolve the conflict under the auspices of UN Security Council Resolution 2254, which is the internationally accepted roadmap for political settlement to the conflict. Before the Syrian government, whether it's this government or any government, can be allowed to rejoin the global community and take part in the global economy, it must also hold accountable those who are responsible for war crimes and other atrocities or human rights abuses. It must cease sponsoring terrorism, and it must create the conditions for the safe, dignified, and voluntary return of refugees to the country. The regime also must, or any government, not just this regime, but any Syrian government, must also verifiably and permanently dismantle its chemical weapons program, sever its ties with Iran's military forces and Iranian-supported groups as well. And it needs to drop its hostility to its regional neighbors. The Caesar Act, we've had a lot of, we've seen a lot of assertions over the last few weeks that the Caesar Act might undermine assistance to the Syrian people, humanitarian assistance to the Syrian people who are suffering in Syria's current, both because of the destruction resulting from the war, but also from the economic crisis that the Syrian regime's territory is undergoing right now, the collapse of the Syrian currency, for example. But it's not the Caesar sanctions or U.S. sanctions that have created the suffering of the Syrian people. The sanctions that we're imposing are designed to deter the regime from continuing its war against the Syrian people, and, as I say, to hold them accountable for what they've already done. The Caesar Act sanctions, as well as all the other sanctions in our Syria program, have extensive exemptions for legitimate humanitarian assistance and activity, and there is a waiver process available, and we have found that there is virtually we haven't yet seen any legitimate humanitarian activity that is precluded by our sanctions program, for which we can't work out some sort of arrangement so that it can continue. I'd close by noting that today's sanctions, 39 in number, are just a first taste of what the U.S. government is going to do under the Caesar Act and similar authorities in the coming weeks and months. We have several tranches of additional sanctions that are already in the pipeline, working their way toward completion. And we expect this not to be just a Caesar day today, June 17th, but we expect this to be a summer of Caesar, where we are putting unprecedented economic and political pressure on the Assad regime to try to compel it to come back into the political process and achieve a fair and just political solution to the conflict under UNSCR 2254. I'll close there, Dana, but thank you very much for the opportunity to address your colleagues today.
Joel, thank you so much. That was incredibly helpful and great for those of us who are working to assess the impact and understand what we can expect from the Caesar sanctions. So thank you so much. Best of luck today as you all roll this out and attempt to explain it.
All right.
Here and abroad. Take care.
Okay. Thank you all. Bye.
Okay, so now we're going to go to the rest of our session. A few introductory remarks. I'm going to introduce our two guests, and then we will move for both of them to provide their introductory remarks. So in the weeks and months leading up to today's Caesar sanctions coming online, we've seen Syria's currency nosedive. Questions have arisen as to whether Moscow is tiring of the Assad regime's intransigence. The COVID-19 pandemic is roiling the Syrian population, already devastated by the world's worst humanitarian crisis. The offensive to retake Idlib appears to be ramping up again, and the regime's potential cracks were on display for all to see on Facebook when Rami Makhlouf, Assad's business tycoon cousin, launched a public appeal. To shed light on the Makhlouf affair and its implications for regime strength and U.S. policy, we are joined by two experts today. Ula Al-Rafai is a fellow in the Washington Institute's Geduld program on Arab politics and a former political asylee from Syria. Her master's thesis at Harvard University, The Self-Flagellation of a Nation, focused on regime survival and the development of Iranian-Syrian relations in the 1970s and 1980s. She is also the executive producer of an award-winning documentary on Syrian refugees, Tomorrow's Children. Sam Dagher is an American-Lebanese journalist and a non-resident fellow at the Middle East Institute. As the only foreigner openly reporting from Damascus for a major Western media outlet in 2012 to 2014, he was briefly detained in an underground regime prison and later expelled from the country. His book, Assad or We Burn the Country, How One Family's Lust for Power Destroyed Syria, was picked as one of the best of 2019 by multiple outlets. So thank you both for joining us today. Ula, over to you to share some thoughts about the Makhlouf affair and what it tells us, and then over to Sam. Thanks again.
Thank you, Dana. Thank you very much. Glad to join this timely and crucial discussion this morning on Syria. Before I start on the Makhlouf affair, I want to recognize the enormous pain and suffering the Syrian people have been enduring, not only for 9 years since the beginning of the Syrian revolution, but actually for 49 years because of Bashar al-Assad and his father before him, Hafez. You know, millions of Syrians are displaced, killed, missing, and so forth, yet still Syrians are not giving up and not staying silent. In fact, their pain is their fuel. Syrians continue to demand freedom, democracy, and dignity, and they're still on the streets today chanting like they did in 2011, long live Syria and down with Bashar al-Assad. Ashat Suriya wa yasqut Bashar al-Assad. So those brave Syrian women and men showed the world that tanks, barrel bombs, and even chemical weapons will not silence them. They will not surrender until they are free from this ruthless regime. Unfortunately, freedom is not cheap. Syria's story is still unfolding, and the path to freedom is very long, but I believe that every step counts. So now to recent dynamics. Recently, the international community witnessed a dramatic war of words between Bashar al-Assad and his massively wealthy cousin, Rami Makhlouf, and Syria's biggest tycoon, basically. While it may seem like a major fracture inside the Assad regime to many observers, I believe the dynamics of past and present family disputes paint somewhat a different picture. As much as I want this Assad regime to crumble today so that Syrians can breathe and move forward, we should remain cautious and not jump to conclusions without carefully assessing the situation inside. It's important to highlight that Makhlouf is the regime itself. He's not an independent businessman. Makhlouf played a massive role in both financing Assad's crackdown on the 2011 revolution and keeping the regime afloat throughout 9 years of war. In my recent piece that I wrote for the Washington Institute on this feud between Assad and Makhlouf, excuse me, I argue that this family has long been riddled by internal fissures. And even when senior members issue threats against each other, it does not necessarily signal that the regime is going to collapse. For instance, the regime survived 2 major family rifts in the past. First was when Bashar Assad's father, Hafez, faced a direct existential threat from his brother, Rifat al-Assad, who marched on Damascus with the aim of taking over the government in 1984. Rifat basically blanketed the street of the capital with posters of him to rally public support. And more importantly, he used his position as commander of the internal security forces and the Saraya Difa paramilitary to mobilize half of Syria's army in a matter of days. He positioned tanks in threatening locations around the capital, Damascus. That showdown between the 2 brothers basically ended when their mother, Naisa Shalish, intervened. Rifat was later stripped of all of his powers and posts, and Hafez permanently exiled him from the country. The second example that I discuss in my piece is the showdown between Bashar and his brother-in-law, Asif Shaukat, basically in 2012. Asif Shaukat was killed under still mysterious circumstances during a meeting at the National Security Headquarters in Damascus, targeted as part of a crisis management cell in which senior military and security officials were tasked with containing the protests and suppressing the revolution by all means possible. Shaukat was at one point Bashar's closest security advisor. But given the Assad family's reputation for settling accounts and protecting their power by murdering close cohorts, many observers believe that Bashar ordered Shaukat's assassination in 2012. I do believe that as well. At the time of the attack, only the regime could have carried out such a sophisticated operation in its own backyard. Also, at that time, rumors of possible military coup orchestrated by Shaukat were circulating shortly before his murder, and defections of army commanders and senior regime officials were on the rise. So those two examples of internal disputes did not lead to regime collapse. Going back to the rift, the one currently between Assad and his wife Asma and Makhlouf, on the other hand, we see that the story has somewhat died down, as I argued in my piece last month. Bashar and Makhlouf, why is that? Bashar and Makhlouf both need each other to keep Syria from financial collapse. The economy declined by over 70% from 2010 to 2017 alone. So further damage could prove fatal at this point, especially in light of international sanctions like the Caesar Act and COVID-19, which have made the country too fragile for anything more than a political theater at this stage, however dramatic it may seem. So in short, whatever internal tension may occur, the regime appears to be just as durable as it was before this incident. Because like if coup attempts in the past, assassinations and years of war did not break this regime, airing dirty laundry on social media like Makhlouf did on Facebook at the end of May and early June, certainly will not either. So I'll stop here, Dana, and yeah. You go.
Thanks so much. Over to Sam.
Good morning and good evening to those joining us from outside the US. First of all, I'd like to thank the Washington Institute for Near East Policy for this very timely discussion. And thanks to everyone for tuning in. I hope you're all staying safe and healthy. I completely agree with Ula that the Syrian people have been dealing with this trauma for half a century, because remember, this family has been in power for 50 years. They've outlasted 8 US presidents since Richard Nixon. So that's what we're talking about. On the Makhlouf affair, I'm going to flesh out some of the points that Ola made and also maybe take it forward to what we just heard from Rayburn regarding the Caesar Act. So one point that's often missed in the discussions of the Rami Makhlouf affair is that he was personally chosen by Bashar al-Assad when he came to power in 2000 to be a conduit for the Assad family's business and financial dealings, and also a financier for the regime. And I mean, I'll share with you this anecdote. Bashar told the Saudis in 2000, speak to Rami, when they told him that they wanted to invest in the country as part of their efforts to bring him into their orbit after Hafiz al-Assad passed away. And also, Bashar picked Rami to help him engineer an economic opening in Syria that would first and foremost enrich the Assad family and their relatives and cronies. So even Rami's cartel, which was set up in 2006, Bashar was involved personally in deciding who among the Syrian businessmen and industrialists was included in this cartel. Bashar picked out the chairman of the cartel, and he designated Rami Makhlouf as the vice chairman of the board. Of course, Rami exploited, the privileged position he was in to amass a huge fortune and to boost his ego and status. But in the end, he works for Bashar al-Assad, and actually still works for him because he's still in the country. Rami was involved in everything from financing the presidential referendum in 2007 for Bashar al-Assad, and also things like Asma al-Assad's shopping sprees. I mean, I'm told that her hairdresser at one point was being paid by the Makhloufs. I'm also told that his wife, Rami's wife, Razan, would accompany Asma al-Assad whenever she went abroad, and she would be the one actually paying for her purchases at whatever store they went into. So that's what we're talking about, somebody who actually works for the family. Bashar did have a chance to remove Rami Makhlouf when the popular uprising started in 2011. In fact, it may have gone a long way to appease the protesters, because they were actually chanting against Makhlouf, and who was at the time, the poster child of the corruption. They were calling him a thief, but Bashar didn't, because he actually needs him and he serves a purpose. He was, as Ula said, he was instrumental in helping the regime evade sanctions and conduct its business through shell companies and front companies in Lebanon and beyond. Rami and other Alawite cronies were also crucial for mobilizing men in their community to fight for the regime when the army unraveled. Alawites were told they were fighting for their existence, not just Bashar al-Assad. So fast forward to 2019, 2020, the economy's in deep trouble, no investment for reconstruction. Patrons, especially Iran, can't help. Lebanon, which always acted as the economic pressure valve for the regime and average Syrians, is in a state of financial and banking collapse. So the options are quite limited. So what does Bashar do? He effectively launches a grand shakedown of Rami and all the other cronies to help shore up, the regime's coffers. So most pay up, but Rami resists and puts out these Facebook videos that we've seen. It's actually quite amazing that, usually these disputes happen behind closed doors, but, this is a first. And Bashar retaliates by freezing Rami's assets and those of his wife and children. I think in the short and medium term, this might actually help Bashar with certain segments of his support base, and also most crucially vis-a-vis his patrons, Iran and Russia. He could tell them, like, look, it's not business as usual. I'm cracking down on corruption. I'm even going, after the main corruption symbol, my cousin, and more so ahead of the summer 2021 elections. I know it's hard for people to believe this, but he is actually planning to organize elections next summer and to win them, barring any major unforeseen circumstances. But this rift could actually be a big problem for the regime if Rami decides to fight and resist being downsized and sidelined, which is actually what's happening now. So he could rally Alawites from his clan and allied clans. He could also lean on the Syrian Social Nationalist Party. The Makhloufs are patrons of this party. This party has its own armed wing, and there's a historic rivalry between the Ba'ath Party and this party. But I think a fight, as Ula said, would not be in the interest of either the Assads or the Makhloufs. In addition to Russia and Iran, I think the relative cohesion of the Alawite community in is actually what's kept this regime alive so far. So depending how bad things get, actually economically, and the pressure that's from this new round of sanctions, which seem quite comprehensive and deep, you could possibly even see a reconciliation between Makhlouf and Assad, because in the past, this is what's happened whenever this family has faced an outside threat. They do come together. And I think also this regime is configured for survival. And what it has always done is wait out its enemies and hope for a change in the political winds in the West. This is an election year in the US, so perhaps they're hoping, President Trump might not get reelected. And of course, the situation this time, though, I think this is what makes it really so difficult for the regime. It's infinitely more complex and challenging. So with that, I will hand it over to you, Dana. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. So we've spent our introductory remarks talking about how to understand and think about the Makhlouf affair. Now I'd like to ask two sets of questions before we open up to audience questions. So for those of you participating, again, you can email your questions to policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. And if you're participating in the Zoom, you can type your questions into the chat function and I'll see them. So I'm going to ask one question and then ask Sam to share his views first, followed by Ula. And my question is about US policy and understanding, contextualizing the Makhlouf affair and its implications for US policy. So broadly speaking, the United States and its partners have sought to pressure the Assad regime to get them to the Geneva process, UN Security Council Resolution 2254, as Joel Rayburn talked about during his remarks, to pressure them to get there to meaningfully participate through a combination of political isolation, economic coercion, sanctions, and denial of reconstruction aid. And the idea is that Assad or his regime cronies will eventually accept that Russia and Iran cannot facilitate his reentry back into the international fold and cannot help him rebuild the country. And eventually he will be forced to participate at the negotiating table in the Geneva process. So many looked at the Makhlouf affair and thought, okay, this is the regime cracking, and is this an opportunity to get the regime to the Geneva process, get them back into the process? So my question for both of you is, do you think this is an opportunity? Yes or no, and why? Sam, over to you first, followed by Ula. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very important to look at the history of sanctions in Syria. I mean, this regime has been sanctioned by the US ever since it's been put on the list of state sponsors of terror in 1979. I mean, we have to keep that in mind. Sanctions have been tightened and loosened over the years. You know, there have been periods of engagement and there have been periods of estrangement. But one key lesson for the regime has been that the US administrations come and go, but the Assads, are there to stay. You know, after the assassination of Rafiq Hariri in Lebanon, the former prime minister, a crime for which the Assad regime was blamed, and also after Bashar's decision to support the insurgency in Iraq, the Bush administration ratcheted up sanctions to the point where you know, Assad couldn't even get spare parts for his private jet when he wanted to travel abroad, and had to ask the Emir of Qatar to loan him, you know, his jet so he can go to Paris in 2008. So, and then there was the Iraq Study Group report that actually recommended engagement with Syria. It said, you know, we had to engage with the regime if we wanted to stabilize Iraq. We had to engage with Syria and Iran. The message Bashar was getting from the US at the time, in the lead up to the first Obama administration, was all will be forgiven if you stop sending suicide bombers to Iraq and help us stabilize Iraq, and also move away from Iran and Hezbollah. I mean, a lot of the same asks that Das Rayburn mentioned. So basically, even also stop using terrorism as a bargaining chip in your dealings with the West. So there was this engagement dance, and we have a history with this regime, and I think he and the Russians and Iranians are probably thinking they could strike a similar bargain with the next administration. Again, if you know, President Trump doesn't get reelected and we have a democratic administration, maybe things will be different. And I also think we have to look at the case of Iraq after the first Gulf War. Saddam and his regime, obviously there are a lot of differences, but there are also a lot of some similarities. Saddam and his regime survived sanctions, but average Iraqis bore the brunt, and you had a complete collapse of the safety net there. So, I mean, all of these things have to be taken into account when we look at the, you know, the Caesar Act and the accompanying sanctions.
To answer, I mean, there's a lot going on, Dana, but thank you for asking this question. I think what we're seeing today in Syria are signs of the current weakness of the regime, not collapse, but weakness of the regime because of this diffusion of power also within. So for Assad, like rapid consolidation of power by him is unlikely at this stage, as much as he likes it, due to like worsening living conditions. Also the financial meltdown and popular uprising right now are bound to create further fractures, in my opinion. But that will still leave Assad with, as Sam said, with a camp of hardened supporters who, one way or another, will still benefit from his presence and his leadership. This situation could manifest itself in the form of turf warfare between like security-backed gangs and their political affiliates in the parliament and the political establishment. Also, anti-Assad demonstrations could take place in some parts, as we are seeing actually now in Sweden in the south. Smaller communities maybe in central Syria, the coastal areas and the mountains may witness some clashes, but details will be murky in my opinion, because a general uprising, as we saw in 2011, somewhat remains unlikely at this stage because of the fractures and divisions. Also, obviously, Iran and Russia, I think they will find themselves more and more involved in arbitrating internal disputes. The greater the schemes are and the factionalization within the Assad regime, the more likely that Iran and Russia will kind of stick by him in order to prevent a meltdown. But greater support could translate also into more self-assertiveness by Assad and demand for greater support and respect. Maybe even a return to like what was going on before as the status quo ante, basically, when he was the undisputed leader. This could also make him unyielding, troublesome, and the Russians and the Iranians may not like that, because Assad is basically a zero-sum game player, and he is incapable of living or creating win-win scenarios. So either you give him what he wants or you take him out. In that case, a coup d'etat or like a military coup will be hard to arrange, considering the number of factions, as I mentioned, involved. Assassination would be the only way to remove him. Iran and Russia are the only players on the scene capable of arranging that. But the question remains is, are they that tired of him? Are they tired of him yet? Are they willing at this stage to deal with the immediate chaotic aftermath of such a development? I don't think so. They don't seem to be there yet, but I don't know, at this stage, things could change like overnight. So yeah, over to you, Dana.
Thank you so much. I have one more question for our two experts. And again, let me remind everyone participating, this has already been such an incredibly rich discussion. You must have questions. Please type them in the chat and I will pose them to our two panelists. My next question for you two is about the Syrian economy. So as we have been discussing, the congressionally mandated Caesar sanctions are coming online today, and the economy was already in a dire situation. The currency is nosedived. Life is increasingly unbearable for Syrian civilians, with the cost of basic goods rising, even for those living in regime-controlled areas. So even though US sanctions on Syria intend to target only Assad and regime backers and regime insiders and those who support the regime, the reality is that more than 80% of Syrians now live under the poverty line. And the World Food Program is now warning that Syria is at risk of famine. The goal of the sanctions is to change regime behavior. So I'd like to ask each of you for your thoughts on the impact of previous rounds of sanctions up to sanctions today. Who is experiencing the most hardship in Syria? Is it the regime? Is it Assad and his family that are suffering from these sanctions? Ula, I'd like to invite you to go first, followed by Sam. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Dana. I think that's a great question. What I want to highlight that the Caesar Act does not call for Assad to step down, unfortunately. I mean, I'm not gonna, be very negative here, but I mean, the Syrians wanted Assad to step down, and they're still calling for regime change. Himself is very problematic at this point. So we should keep that in mind. The US used to call, during the Obama administration, used to call for Assad to step down, but not anymore, unfortunately, because of complicated dynamics, and also because the US, I believe, really, and the Obama policy on Syria was not effective at all. And we have missed the boat of regime change, though I know Syrians will not give up. So back to the Caesar Act, I think despite that there are humanitarian aid provisions, the sanctions will mostly affect the average Syrian, to be honest. And that's how the regime works. I know Rayburn mentioned that it will not, but the dynamics inside are different, to be honest. So all the burdens are transferred to the wider citizenry, while the ruling elite usually and their immediate supporters remain sheltered. And that has been always the case for all of these years. So the impact of these sanctions will also will feed the dynamics that I just talked about, like Russia, Iran, and so forth, and how things could change in the future. So yeah, the Syrians are many Syrians in the south right now, and in Idlib and other areas are asking for regime change, and I don't think they will be satisfied by the sanctions that under the Caesar Act. So I don't know. Over to you.
Sam, would welcome your thoughts too. Thank you.
Thank you. I think, Dana, I'm going to touch on this idea of the war economy in Syria. So I would actually go further than Ola. I mean, in her earlier remarks, she said Bashar al-Assad is weak. I would say that he's actually the weakest he's ever been in the past 20 years. I mean, outwardly, he's the victor, but really, he's only there. He's only able to hang on because his two principal patrons, Iran and Russia, want him there. The moment they withdraw their support, he's finished. So he's at his weakest point. I know we talk about victory, and he talks about victory, but we have to really keep that in mind. So this new raft of sanctions is coming in that context. I mean, during the height of the war, he was actually in a better position. Funds were flowing from Iran to finance the war. Credit was coming from Russia. He completely co-opted the UN humanitarian program. This is a multi-billion-dollar program to help Syrians, but it was co-opted by the regime for him to reward his supporters and punish his opponents. And also, I think the cronies, including Makhlouf, were in full crisis mode in the service of the regime. You also had Lebanon next door. That's no longer available. And also, I wouldn't underestimate the looting, the mass looting that we were seeing in areas that were reverting back to regime control. It was a way for the regime to reward and appease those fighting for him, for Bashar al-Assad and their families as well. Now people are saying, where are the fruits of victory? Why are we worse off now than we were actually at the height of this so-called global conspiracy against Syria, or global war? I mean, to borrow from the regime's propaganda. So, in fact, things were better at the height of the conflict. I think at this point, the regime has probably a few options if the situation really gets worse. It could escalate the military campaign in Idlib. or find a way to provoke a crisis, because this regime is most comfortable when there is a crisis or a military conflict in the country. Or even, I mean, this is really, if the regime and the Iranians and Hezbollah get really desperate, you could see them provoke some sort of clash, around the Golan Heights. So that has to be, taken into consideration. And also, but he can also go the conciliatory, option, which be to stall and buy time, to say, I want to talk, I want to engage, with this UN process, in the hopes that, again, that the Trump administration would not get would be on its way out, and President Trump won't be reelected for a second term. But also, again, depending on really how deep these new sanctions cut, you could see him and Iran and what's called the axis of resistance. I mean, since the Iranians always say he is a key member of that axis, you could see them rally and try to confront this new existential threat, I guess. Also, you could see him perhaps reach out to China. I mean, he's done it before. The Chinese have called these new sanctions quote unquote inhumane, because they're coming in the context of the coronavirus pandemic. So you could see Bashar al-Assad reaching out to China, but that's not going to be so easy. I mean, the Chinese have their own issues with the U.S. I mean, do they want to get involved in Syria? Do they want to confront the U.S. there? I mean, I just spoke to a former Syrian diplomat, Bassam Barbandi, and he said, yeah, I mean, it could happen. He sees it possibly happening, Bashar reaching out to the Chinese, but it's not going to be so straightforward.
Thank you so much for that. We have one question, Sam, directed to you, is do you see any conditions? You mentioned elections, that Assad is preparing for elections next year. So the question is, do you see any conditions under which these elections next year could be accepted internationally? And also, since you just raised that one thing we need to look at is how deep the sanctions coming online, how deep they cut, how much of an appetite do you think there is for investment? And was there a big appetite for investment in Syria before Caesar implementation? So the question is, do you think that there was significant interest in investment before that will now drop off as a result of Caesar sanctions coming online?
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So I'll tackle the first one. I mean, I was actually in Syria when he organized his last elections in 2014. It was a total sham, and that's actually what he intends to do. Maybe with the help of Russia, with the help of Iran, to say, look, I'm engaging with this UN process, this new constitution. But his idea would be maybe to bring a couple of opposition figures into his government. I mean, that's the extent of it. People that he would feel comfortable with. I mean, that's what we're talking about. I don't think that would be acceptable to the Syrian people, who, after 10 years, we're talking about 700,000 dead, half the country destroyed, the country fractured, because remember, I mean, we're talking about an area that's controlled by the regime, but with Bashar al-Assad being propped up by Iran and Russia, there's a part of Syria in the northwest, Idlib, controlled by Turkey, another part in the north, also controlled by Turkey. You have the YPG, the Kurds in the northeast. So the country is fractured. You have also 7 million Syrians abroad. That wasn't the case under his father when he faced a similar challenge, in the late 70s, early 80s. So you're talking about 1/3 of the population, and most of these people, won't go back to Syria if he's still in power. So what elections are we talking about?
Yeah.
And I mean, like Ola, basically. And regarding the investments, appetite for investment, reconstruction. I mean, the Russians tried to pull this off right after the campaign, the bloody campaign, retake, Ghouta, suburban Damascus. They went to the Europeans, to the Germans and the French, and said, if you want refugees not to come from Syria anymore, if you want to make sure that ISIS doesn't come back, then you have to help this regime. You have to help this regime rebuild the country. And the Europeans said no. And even allies, I mean, like the Chinese, they were not so eager. I mean, the regime had a couple of fairs, business and reconstruction fairs. People came from some countries, but actually people like committing money and saying, they're going to invest. We haven't seen that at all.
Thank you so much. We have a question from Abe Shulsky of the Hudson Institute. I'm going to invite Ula to answer it first, and then Sam back cleanup if there's anything else you would like to add to what Ula says. Is there a chance that Alawites in the coastal area would want to throw off the Assad regime, given that they now have so little to show for all their sacrifices in fighting for it? Would they be able to resist the regime, and how would the Russians react? Thank you.
Thank you, Dana. Great question. In fact, back in 2014, I wrote about the Alawite community in Foreign Affairs magazine, and I said that, unlike what many believe, the Alawite community is not monolithic. Like, the Alawite community is divided and has been divided for a long time. So, and very weakened and silenced. For example, like personal example, back in 2004, I went to Qurdaha. I was on a hiking trip, but basically, because you pass by Qurdaha, you have to stop and go and see the tomb of Bashar al-Assad and Hafiz al-Assad and kind of give respect, whatever. It's kind of like mandatory. You have to do it, otherwise you'll be in serious trouble. So unfortunately, I had to go inside with some of my friends, and after I got out, I walked around in the village, and Qurdaha is the hometown of this family, Hafiz al-Assad and Bashar. You cannot imagine, like, that's back in 2004. It was very, very poor. Like, people had barely no electricity, no water. Only you see just villas of basically the family, the Assad family, and their senior advisors and so forth. But the average Alawite person has been living in poverty, like many Syrians, under the poverty line, like 40% of them at that time. And they've been suffering, and then they were sending their children throughout this war to be basically killed. They didn't have a choice because they were afraid of the regime. So basically, they're terrorized by the Assad family, the Alawite community. And we saw a lot of divisions back in 2014, 15, and some of the members tried to, of the community and the elites tried to kind of defect somehow and present certain leaders instead of Bashar, and then they were silenced, obviously. So when Assad says he has a community of supporters, that's kind of, not completely true, to say the least. So today, when it comes to the Alawite community, you mentioned Russia, how would Russia react if there is somewhat of an uprising within the community? And there are different, here and there in the coastal region, in the mountains, some clashes that's happening. That's not it is happening. It's been happening for the past 9 years. I think Russia at that point will have to recalculate its risks. Russia want to be in charge kind of in the region, and of course of what's going on in Syria on the ground and Bashar. Russia has the ability to remove him if they want to, Putin and his cronies, as I mentioned before. However, I'm not sure if they're ready yet, and they won't remove Assad until they feel that it is in their favor to remove him. He's basically their puppet, and they don't want to deal with the chaotic aftermath, as I mentioned before, if Assad is gone. They have to calculate what's going to happen next, and also cooperate with Iran. So the Alawite community can if they rose up, they can pressure, add another additional pressure for regime change. However, it's somewhat complicated at this stage. So we'll see. We'll see. Thank you, Dana.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add a couple of quick points to what Ola said. I mean, I completely agree with Ola. I mean, these rifts have been there before. I visited the area multiple times between 2013 and 14, and the people I spoke to in the coastal area were telling me, I mean, other Syrians think we're like wealthy and we're benefiting from this regime, but we're actually dirt poor because the wealth and power is concentrated in the hands of the elites, people like Makhlouf and other powerful families of the regime. But this guy told me, if we hadn't heard this like blatant sectarian rhetoric coming from the opposition side, maybe we, at the beginning of in 2011, and a lot of people were saying that it was the regime was actually fanning these sectarian tensions in order to scare the Alawites. But we did actually, at some point in 2011, later on, I mean, we did hear some sectarian language coming from the opposition, and this really was exploited by the regime to scare the Alawites and to get them to rally around the regime and to fight the regime and to convince them that they're actually fighting for their existence. The moment the opposition that was painted as extremist Sunni comes to power, they're finished. So in their mind, they were fighting for their existence. But throughout the war, I mean, there were a lot of tensions and rifts within the community, particularly over the issue of the fighters and the militiamen that were captured by the opposition fighters. The regime never able to find out what happened to these people, and the families asking the regime to do more. So we've seen actually protests sometimes in relation to this issue of the missing. So the problems have been there, and also now, I mean, what I said about Syrians and particularly the support base expecting the so-called fruits of victory, and this not coming. The other point I would also stress, and I would also agree with Ola on, is Russia. I mean, Russia has groomed powerful generals in the Alawite community, and if Russia chooses to have an alternative, I mean, perhaps that's a possibility. There's always talk that in the community itself, there's a camp that's closer to Iran, and there's another camp that's closer to Russia. So that's an important dynamic. And also, I would go back to the Makhlouf affair. I mean, if really Makhlouf decides to fight and resist, that could really change the dynamic within the community.
If I may add one quick point, Dana, just to follow up on Sam. Thank you, Sam. Just back to 2011, when you mentioned the sectarian, yes, we saw some sectarian language, as you said. I agree with you, from the opposition. However, 2011, like early days, maybe the first or second day of the uprising, I have videos saved on my laptop, and I have my still family on the ground, extended family. One of the main videos that was taken on the ground of the protest was an Alawite, Alawite young man saying, "We are Alawites, and I am here with my fellow Syrians, who Christians and Sunnis, and we're all in this together." So their voices were heard, and their voices were part of the uprising in 2011, and they're still, like many, I mean, they're secretly they're afraid, like, I mean, there is very small community, And the regime just kind of assassinates anyone that's against them, especially when it comes from their own community, is a huge threat. But we should not forget that the Alawite community, and I have a lot of friends from the Alawite community, well, some of them are still in support of Assad because, for their own reasons, but others and Christians are saying, no, he's not the protector of minorities in Syria. So just wanted to highlight that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We are 1 minute past the hour, so we are going to conclude this event. I want to thank our two experts so much, Ula and Sam, for spending this time with us, sharing your expertise and views. This has been incredibly enlightening for me, and you've raised a lot of good points that I will now follow going forward. So thank you again. Thank you all for joining us, whether you're here in the United States, in Europe, in the Middle East, beyond. We hope that you benefited from this discussion and from the expertise of our two guests. And please follow the Washington Institute for future events about Syria and the broader Middle East. Thank you again. Have a good day.